I'm actually delighted to have with us at Krea for this event a dear colleague, Dr. Ayurdhi Dhar, an assistant professor at University of West Georgia. This term, we are organizing a speaker series, a psychology event where we are inviting various guests to talk about and share with us what does it mean for them to think like a psychologist and how do they frame the question of the psychological. So and my colleague Dr. Sabba Siddiqui is teaching a course by the same name, Thinking Like a Psychologist. And I'm delighted to have you here, Ayuthi, to speak with us and share how you conceptualize the psychological. I would like to introduce her formally to our guests to all of you. So Dr. Ayurdhi Dhar is an assistant professor of psychology at University of West Georgia in the US. She has taught psychology in the United States and in India, where she's also worked as a therapist. She's the author of Madness and Subjectivity, a cross-cultural examination of psychosis in West and India. Her research interests include discursive practices sustaining the concept of mental illness, decolonial theory, schizophrenic subjectivity, trauma and immigration, corrupt research practices, and the critiques of ahistorical and acontextual forms of knowledge. She's currently the head editor of Mad in South Asia and affiliate of Mad in America. So welcome, Ayurdhi. We are honored to have her as a first speaker in the speaker series as well. Over to you.
Good afternoon. Today I'm here to talk in this series called Thinking Like a Psychologist, right? And I don't know if you guys read the abstract for the talk or something, but I was honestly wondering, why me? I am the last person who should be called for thinking like a psychologist. I'm not kidding, right? I come from a critical psychology perspective. The topic of my talk literally is the dangers of thinking like a psychologist. So it made me wonder, like, maybe, this is not a good fit. And should I really be the first speaker? Maybe they should have some speakers who will talk about thinking like a psychologist, and then I can come later and, talk about the dangers. But then I realized a few things, okay? First, there are very few people, I think, who are not somehow aware of psychology a little bit, right? Whether it's via Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, or some kind of a pop psychology thing that talks about, don't tell your trauma to your friends, it's called trauma dumping, or tells you that you must express yourself, or boundaries are romanticized, you must cut off all the toxic people from your life and have all the self-care and self-love. Whatever it is, psychology is everywhere, right? So when I was told that the students, they are a little new to psychology, I was like, okay, that's not a bad thing, right? I'm getting them early. I'm going to hook them on early to this thing. So yeah, there is that. Plus, I was told that, in the first year, a lot of you've learned about scientific reasoning, about ethics. And I think that's a beautiful beginning, right? Because it gives you a kind of a critical perspective. So here's what happened to me. I did my undergrad from Delhi University. I did my master's from Delhi University. And for me, a huge part of my work was unlearning everything I had read and learned. And I am glad that you would not be going through the same, right? Because usually what we do is we are like, acha, study this person and study this theory and write about them. And then in like 5 words, write about the limitations of their work, right? So critique is always baad mein. Critique is always an afterthought. And that is a dangerous thing if you don't take critical perspective seriously. So let me give you an example, okay? I'm going to assume many of you don't know this person's work. In psychology, there's a theory about children, right? It's based on the work of Mary Ainsworth. And the theory is just kind of based on this experiment, right? In the experiment, I'm telling this very loosely, okay? It's more formal. In the experiment, they take this little kid and she's in a room in a laboratory with toys and her mommy, and then mommy leaves the room but a stranger is there, and we're trying to figure out how does the kid react to mommy not being there but a stranger being there. And based on this experiment, and there are different, there's very cool research design, by the way, we are like, hey, some kids are closely attached to their parents, to their mothers. Some kids are avoidant. Some kids are undecided. In my undergrad, I was reading this theory. And at no point did I question, what about a culture like India? What about a culture in which it's not just mommy, daddy, and me? What happens in a culture if you're constantly surrounded by strangers and extended family members and a million cousins? Would a child still react the same way if her mommy leaves the room? Would she be like, yeah, whatever, I have somebody else here who's, playing with me? And if that were to happen, in mainstream psychology, we might consider this child to be not well attached and not well developed. I never asked these questions. For me, critique came much later. And as much as I love my DU education, I am really hoping that the fact that we are beginning today from a critical perspective will make sure that when you guys, or if you guys do enter psychology, or if you do end up being a psychologist, you will have more questions. You will question more assumptions, right? You'll be like, maybe it's not as simple as that. Maybe I should be asking questions about this. Okay. So I just wanted to give like a little thing on, me being here, because to be honest, there are major dangers with the way we do any kind of science or any kind of knowledge building, if we are not very careful in questioning it. So I don't know. And this is, by the way, not just true for psychology. It stands for science as a whole. So I don't know if you guys know this, but BMJ is the British Medical Journal, and it is one of the most reputable scientific journals in the world. Getting a paper in it, to matlab saalo lag jate hain. It is so difficult to get published in it. Okay, this is like the big, reputed high elite journal, scientific journal. The editor, one of the ex-editors of the journal, 2 years ago, just came out and said, guys, 20% of medical research is garbage. It's pure fraud. He didn't just say psychological research, he said medical research. He said, the time has come that when we read research, instead of believing it, we need to actually wonder if this even happened, because the fraud in medical research is so bad. As academics, as researchers, we are taught to worship journals. Matlab, ek journal mein aa gaya, to sach hai. This is the truth with a capital T. And here are people coming in and saying that a lot of what's published here is garbage, essentially. This is meaningless. Not all of it, but a lot of it. How did we reach here? Okay, sorry, somebody said something. Let me check. No, okay, somebody's mic might be on. It's all right. So then the question is like, how did we reach here? How did we reach the stage in which a giant portion of the research that is published, that is there, that you guys, when you go on your little website and be like, okay, I'm going to use Google Scholar to find something, might not be legitimate in the first place? See, this is what happens when critique is an afterthought. This is what happens when we learn something and we put it in the exam, and then like 4 saal baad somebody comes and says this does not apply, and you're like, oh my god, I have to relearn everything. So this is the reason we are talking about this today, right? And like I said, by the way, it's not just psychology. This is pervasive in the medical field and beyond. But if I remember right, this was the same editor of BMJ, British Medical Journal, and they were talking about in the same paper, like there were these big studies that showed that there was a drug called mannitol, and it reduced death by half for people who had a head injury. So, motorcycle chala rahe ho, you fall, head injury. This drug was a miracle cure. And then they found out that half of the studies testing this drug had never taken place, right? The lead author, they could not find the author. The institution that the author had said they were from, they could not find that. It did not exist. So this is a problem in psychology, but it is a problem much wider than that. And this is, again, why critique has to be built into education, why questioning has to be built into education, and not something that comes later after you've studied things. Okay. So the question today is thinking like a psychologist. Um, before that, do you guys want to ask any questions? Do you want to do it later? Later? Right now? I'll keep talking and then maybe we can have a conversation later. Okay? Okay, all right. Okay, so if I were to ask someone, what does it mean to think like a psychologist? They might say something like, scientific reasoning. You are unbiased. You are an objective researcher. You objectively get the data. You have no biases and no emotions and feelings around this. And you analyze the data and you produce your results. Another person might say, thinking like a psychologist is about compassion. They might be thinking of a therapist, right? Or a counselor. It's about empathy. Thinking like a psychologist is thinking with an open heart. And that's the basis. And those are both absolutely true. And those are both relevant. And those are both absolutely accurate. But there is more to the story. So you see, it's not just about thinking like a psychologist. The thing we are looking at today is that psychology also has a way of thinking, right? And normally when I say, what do you mean by psychology has a way of thinking? Somebody will say, matlab scientific thinking, right? But today we're going to challenge that because there is this thing we assume. Hum assume karte hain. Of course, like, there are the way psychology thinks about anyone. A person comes to me and says, I hear voices of my dead mother, right? She's dead, but I hear her telling me things like, जाके बेड बनाओ अपने हस्बैंड का खाना ठीक से बनाओ something like that, right? I'm actually quoting a Tanya Lerman and research here. And psychology says that's a pathology. You are schizophrenic. This is immediately begin taking antipsychotics, right? And go to a hospital and we will admit you. So in this talk, we will kind of talk about how does psychology think? Because often it looks natural. The way psychology thinks is impartial, unbiased. It's completely neutral, right? It has no biases. But we're going to challenge that. We're going to kind of talk about this idea that the way psychology thinks is the natural way of thinking, right? And there is a beautiful quote. I don't remember who said it. I never remember who says quotes. I just kind of sort of remember the quote. And it says, all psychology is indigenous psychology. And what that means is ki we have this idea, okay? Indigenous psychology, it comes from places like India. It comes from places like parts of South Africa, so Kenya, parts of East Asia, China se, Korea se kuch aaya, part of Native American communities in the US and Canada. We call these psychologies indigenous psychology. But somebody came in and said, that's ridiculous. All psychology has come from a place. It might be Europe, it might be Canada or America. All psychology is indigenous. It is based on the way people of that region think. So if they think something is good and bad, that will enter psychology. Okay, let me give you a simple example of this, huh? Can you guys put something in chat if you know that, if as a kid you slept next to your parents as a baby, or you saw your brother or sister being raised, sleeping right next to your parents. Just put like a thumbs up or something in chat. Yes, like a why. I just want to see how many people, are like, yeah. Most babies in India, right, sleep next to their parents. Yeah, absolutely. There it is, right? It is literally the most common way parenting is done across the world. This is not just true for India, across the global south, right? It is super common. I have over 16 right now, right? At the same time, let me show you a billboard, an ad, okay? So to do that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. What you see here is an American ad. This is in Milwaukee, and this was plastered on big billboards. And what this ad says is that sleeping next to your baby is as dangerous for the baby as giving them a knife. right? Look at these babies. They're sleeping next to a butcher knife. Any choti si knife, like tomato katne wali. No, this is a giant butcher knife, okay? And your baby sleeping with you can be just as dangerous. Now, this was a massive ad campaign. It was built on really terrible research. But here is the thing. It was backed by developmental psychology, child psychology, right? And most of the world, this is how they sleep. For that matter, there are two big pieces of research. Parts of the world where people sleep next to their babies have lower rates of babies dying of suffocation, SIDS. And number two, in the UK, it's Pakistani women who have the lowest rates of babies dying sleeping next to them. And the reason is Islam considers alcohol to be a problem. So the only time you are a danger to your baby if you sleep next to them is if you're drunk or on drugs. Otherwise, it is a much safer thing to do than put them away in a different room. But because in the US and Canada, this is traditional, the knowledge that comes out of the US and Canada portrays this. And it shames mothers into sleeping next to their babies, which evolutionary psychologists are saying, guys, it is the most like, it is essential for a child's brain development to have that kind of connection, that social connection. So this is kind of what I mean when I say we have to challenge, all psychology is indigenous psychology. It comes from a perspective. And more often than not, it's the perspective of Euro America, Canada, global North region. It's not bad. It's not awful or evil. It is just restricted. It applies to the people who live there. It applies to some people who live there, but it falls apart. So then the question is, why should I care about how psychology is thinking? Why should I care about the biases in the way psychology thinks? And the reason is, if you don't, then you will take the methods that psychology uses for granted, whether it's experimental method, whether it's qualitative research, whether it's anything, right? You will take those methods for granted. You will think that they are written by God themselves and, cannot be questioned. And if you do that, you will accept the results without questions and critiques. And that becomes dangerous. And again, psychology and psychiatry, I call them the side disciplines. There's psychology, counseling, psychiatry, and that whole thing. They are some of the worst off in this, but it's pretty bad across medical field. If anybody wants to have fun, they can watch this documentary on Netflix called The Bleeding Edge, and you will be terrified. So it's called The Bleeding Edge, just in case. So then the question comes, what are these dangers that I keep talking about, right? What happens if we don't question psychology's way of thinking, of their way of analyzing? So to do that, let me ask you, does anyone know about the marshmallow experiment in psychology? Yeah, a couple of people. Should we watch a little video of the marshmallow experiment? Those kids are kind of cute. Okay, so let me find it, okay? I'm going to show you like just a couple of minutes. And then you will have some context about what I'm talking about. No. Marshmallow experiment. All right. Let's do this. Okay. So I'm going to show you a little experiment. Okay, it's a classic experiment in child psychology. And what the experiment shows is, it shows that children, when it was first done, that children who are able to have self-control, right? Later on in life, they have better grades, they have higher achievement, they do well overall. Tiny little kids with more self-control at a tiny little age, 10, 15 years down the line, are doing much better, okay? And this is the simple experiment. As a psych student, you will definitely go through this. It's very popular. Okay, let's open this. Let's share sound. Just 2 minutes of this. Okay.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow, for you. You can either wait and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right.
So let me rephrase it. The child is supposed to not eat the little candy in front of them. Okay, it's a marshmallow, it's a little candy. The child has to wait and not eat it. And if the child is able to do that, they will get 2 pieces of marshmallows later. That's all the whole experiment is.
I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. It smells really good.
All right, so it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay.
Okay, I'm not going to show the whole thing. Okay, but this was the basis of the experiment. And again, let me rephrase. We're talking about what are the dangers of not questioning psychology's way of thinking, right? What are the dangers of just assuming that the methods are perfect, that the results are okay? So this experiment comes out, says that kids who were able to stop themselves had better achievement and grades later. Kids, and no one questioned that, okay? Until recently, when we found out that most of the kids, all the kids actually in the beginning who were tested were kids from a daycare center. And this daycare center, where was the research done? I think it was either at Stanford or Harvard. So these are professors with a bunch of money, right? These were kids of people who were rich, right? And when you are rich and you have a bunch of candy at home, you can just, you can stop yourself from eating. Not only that, when you are rich, you have the resources to have tutors, you have the resources to get extra help. So your achievement scores are going to be better. Your parents have contacts, so you get better jobs eventually, right? For decades, we were like, these kids did better because they didn't eat the marshmallow because they had better self-control. And we completely forgot the social context that they were a part of, right? So that example is important because of something I mentioned in the abstract. There, of the many different ways that psychology thinks, I'm going to tell you about three basic biases, right? Ways of thinking that are not perfect, that we should question, if nothing else, right? They're not bad, they're not good, they just should be questioned. One of those is, as a joke, I always say, if you guys were psychology people, this would be funny, that psychology suffers from fundamental attribution error. Okay, and this big fancy word called fundamental attribution error, this big phrase, it's very simple. Okay, in social psychology, you will study it if you end up taking it. All it says is, when you ask someone, why did this person in front of you do this thing, right? People have a tendency to blame something inside the person. So somebody cuts you in traffic and you go, you call them a name, right? But you drive like a maniac and you're like, mujhe to jaldi hai, main to theek kar raha hu, right? So fundamental attribution error is called fundamental. Essentially, this was a psychological concept that was saying that this is fundamental to humanity, to human beings, right? We all think like this. Ki kuch ho jaye and you ask people, why did this happen? They have a tendency to be like, it's something inside the person. Why did they get divorced? Because, ladki tez the, right? Something inside. We don't look at the social circumstances. We don't look at the external circumstances.
Recording in progress.
That happened. Okay. Maybe it went away for a second. Okay. So that's what I think. One, we now know fundamental attribution error is not fundamental. You don't find it in many cultures. And the Indian culture is one of those things, the South Asian culture. When you ask people here why someone did something, most of the time they attribute it to unka time kharab chal raha tha. Not something inside a person, but their circumstances. Unki family mein tension thi, unki property ka ye tha, right? So it is not fundamental. So big red flag right there. The second thing is, I personally think psychology as a science, not as a science, psychology as a discipline suffers from this error. Every time we have to explain as psychologists, why did this happen? We look inside the person. Okay. There is, I think, Sudarshan Kotai in Christ. God, I might be confusing two different professors. Okay. But there's a professor in Christ in Bangalore, and he has written a beautiful paper about farmer suicide in the South. And he's talking about how psychology has failed these farmers because counselors come in and they're like, they have depression, give them an antidepressant, right? So in their chemicals, their serotonin, norepinephrine have become imbalanced. Look at these people, they're crying all day, they're talking about suicide. The only reason for suicide is depression. So let's give them therapy, let's give them counseling. And if you do that, you are looking inside the person and forgetting that these farmers are also deeply exploited, oppressed by the money lending, people. They are in debt. They are scared of what rainfall will bring, too much or too little. So they're constantly insecure. They are food insecure despite being farmers. So what that does is, traditionally in mainstream psychology, it makes you look only inside. And that is the definition of fundamental attribution error. Right? So if you do become psychologists, if you do become therapists, if you do become researchers, knowing this should make you be careful that when a patient comes in and says, I am, mere ko dhad dhad ho raha hai, which is a very common local way of talking about, something similar to anxiety, like a ghabrahat, right? That you not only look at what's happening inside their mind and their psyche, but also look at what are their social circumstances, right? Is this a man who's really scared of losing his job and has 2 kids who are dependent on him, right? Because IT is falling apart and, there are massive layoffs happening or something, right? So you, as a psychologist, if you choose that path, have to be able to cut through that bias and that fundamental attribution error, okay? It's also the same thing, I'll talk about trauma later. Okay. So throughout psychology, we make this error. Whether we're talking about chemical imbalance, I'm sure some of you have at least heard this. What is depression? It's a chemical imbalance. The serotonin goes out of order, or norepinephrine goes out of order. I don't know if you guys have seen, there are so many Instagram posts about, this is my daily dose of serotonin. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that. And it would be a picture of a puppy or a picture of like the mountains. And every time I see that, I'm like, no, you don't want that. Excess serotonin can cause a ton of problems. Like it is terrifying. We now have that research. But traditionally, we have been told that's all the problem is. All your problems is just something within you, right? It's your childhood. Let's look within you. It's your chemicals. Let's look within you, right? And that is kind of dangerous because it can put a lot of pressure and blame on a person. So that's one of the other things psychology can do. In its best form, it should bring people together. It should connect you, right? But in its worst form, it disconnects people. It tells people this is just within you. And, so I don't know if anybody's heard the concept of trauma dumping. Yeah. Okay. This is a new psychology thing. Okay. It basically says if you've gone through something traumatic, which by the way, pretty much most human beings do. Trauma is a very common experience, right? Don't talk to your friends and family about it, because then you're trauma dumping on them. Go talk to a therapist about it. That is such a disconnecting idea, man. Like, through the thousands of years and more, people have depended on each other, their friends, their community, their loved ones, to get over the awful things that happened to them. And now we are telling them disconnect, disconnect, disconnect. Cut off these people, cut off those people. That is toxic and this is toxic. And it's all about self-care. And then you're left in a little bubble of self-care in which you have lit some beautiful candles and you're taking a bath and you're sipping a cup of coffee and you're all alone. And the second idea is that if you experience whatever difficulty or suffering you're experiencing in your body, it is wrong. We call that somatic symptoms, right? So imagine something simple. Put a yes if some of you get a stomachache before an exam, right? Because you're nervous. Yep. At least I see a few people. Yep. That nervousness, stomachache before the exam. Yeah. So it's a somatic thing, right? Now, there are a couple of ways of thinking about it. That if you're feeling it in your body, it's not the right way to feel it. You should talk about it. You should process it emotionally. You should use your words. You should verbalize it, right? Talk to a friend about it. Talk to your therapist about it. But we have seen from the work of Lawrence Cormier and many others that to feel things in your body is actually the most common way people across cultures experience things. It is so. Cormier traces the history, which is why if you guys have taken a course in history, you are so lucky. History is this amazing, amazing thing. It teaches us so many things. Is that psychology's tradition is based on Euro-American values, which is perfectly fine, good enough values, right? They just don't apply easily everywhere. And in Euro-American values, the body is not like it's considered traditionally in psychology. If you read the older texts, I'm going to use the words that they use. It's the primitive people, the savages, and the unsophisticated people of the global South and the East and parts of Africa and South Asia, us who experience things in their body. The right way to experience it is emotionally, is up in your head, is to talk about it. Who said that? Why haven't we questioned it? I mean, I personally say I am actually okay with having a 15-minute stomachache before today's presentation, right? I mean, I'm nervous before every class, let alone like talking to a completely different university. Like, 10 minute pet dard hoga. I don't have to talk to someone and process my emotions over it. I'm fine with my stomachache, right? So there is some really good work out there that questions this. And if you don't question it, right? Then let's say you become a psychologist, and as a researcher or a teacher or a therapist or a counselor, you might look at someone who's having bodily experiences of things. In North India, one of the common ones is people talk about dhar, right? It's similar to anxiety, right? In parts of Africa, people talk about this burning sensation on their skin when they're going through some difficult stuff, right? You will look at them and you will say, this is the wrong way of experiencing it. You need to translate this and change it into words or emotional processing. And that's pretty messed up, because here is the thing. We've been told, we've read this, that if you repress your emotions, they come out as something bad, right? Repressing of emotions is a bad thing. Well, guess what? There is cultural research that shows that's true for people from the global north, partly from the west, but East Asians, Nisbet's research has showed it doesn't apply to them. So when you put people like this I think was, where did they do this? I don't remember. Some part of East Asia. They put people in experimental situations where they experienced anger, but they were not able to show anger. And they tested their blood pressure, their heart rate, their neural stuff, and they had a very perfectly okay response. You test the same thing amongst people in the UK and Canada, and they have huge spikes in blood pressure when they feel angry, but they cannot express the anger, right? So this idea that expression is the only way to be healthy is problematic. I am not saying expression is bad. I'm not saying emotional processing is bad. Okay, be careful. I'm saying it's not the only way. That's it, right? So if you get patients and participants who experience their things differently, sometimes in their body, and other people might find benefit in talking to someone, you should be open to those different experiences and ways of being. Instead of being like, this is primitive, this is unsophisticated, you need to translate your body stuff into the psyche stuff. And that's the only way to do it. Okay. And this is a basic thing. Basically, Instagram psychology is full of this stuff at this point. And the third one, actually, I think I already went through the third one. I don't remember. Never mind. So let me tell you this then. Since we're talking about this talk is supposed to be about a little bit about methods and research and stuff, right? Often as students, you will go on Google Scholar or whatever thing your university uses to try and find research stuff and articles and things like that. And you might be like, well, I found a bunch of research that says verbalization is healthier, right? Or I found a bunch of research. Let's take the example of, okay, because this is important. Let's take the example of antidepressants, okay? Most of us know what antidepressants are, right? These are the pills we give people when they experience really terrible low mood for a long enough period of time. The belief is that antidepressants work on your serotonin and your norepinephrine, which are brain chemicals, neurotransmitters, and they fix it, okay? If you do a simple Google search, you will find amazing things about it. But more and more, there are massive changes and questions being asked about, one, are antidepressants effective? Two, are they safe? Ooh, electricity. Okay, yes. So you guys can hear me? There is no glitch? Okay, so I'll just stay here. A few months ago, again, British Medical Journal, this massive umbrella review came out. Now, what is an umbrella review? You know how a bunch of people do research? A review looks at all of that research to see what is the evidence, right? So it's a research of a research. It's supposed to be up there. We worship these things, right? Came out that basically said that the serotonin hypothesis of depression, it doesn't seem like it has any good basis, okay? Couple of things started happening. One, this came out in BMJ. As a chota mota journal mein nahi aaya, so the whole world was paying attention, right? And this is threatening. This is very threatening because we've been telling people this is just a chemical imbalance, right? Then started this huge, funny, awful fight. Bunch of psychiatrists came in and said, we to never said it was a chemical imbalance. Humne to and said, yes, you did. Here is all the evidence. It's in the DSM. I will talk about that. My point is that you have to be careful in even the way you consume research, right? I don't know if you know this, but okay. It says my connection is unstable. Is it okay? Okay, all right. If I zone out, let me know and I will,
Minor glitch, but we can make sense of it.
Okay, because if you want, I can shift to Wi-Fi, but if it's okay, then I'll just let it be. Okay. So when we're talking about things like, why is it that when I open Google Scholar or something, as a consumer of research, this is where you have to be careful, right? I find all of this stuff saying antidepressants are great. They work beautifully. We're going to come down to talking about now actual research practices, okay? I don't know if you guys know this. This is just a little bit of information. Last year, the National Institute of Care and Excellence, which is the big main government science body in the UK, they changed their guidelines about antidepressants. Earlier, we used to believe that if you stop taking antidepressant, you have some chota mota problems until 6 weeks or so. But we found out that those problems are not chota mota. If you stop taking them, it's called withdrawal, and they can last up to a year, and they can be terrible. So terrible that people often think when they stop that I'm having a relapse, and what they're having is not relapse, they're having a withdrawal. If you're taking heroin and you stop taking heroin, you experience withdrawal. If you're taking coffee and you take a lot of coffee, right, a lot, and you stop taking it, you're going to experience withdrawal, right? Same with cigarettes, same with cocaine, and same with psychotropics like antidepressants. So it was just like 2 years ago that NICE changed those guidelines and accepted that, the withdrawal is severe and strong and long lasting for many patients. Okay. So this brings us into kind of sort of the last section, right? Which is the section on research, right? We're talking about why it's important to question psychology's ways of thinking. And now we've come to, based on those ways of thinking, are certain methods and research and the way that's done. And what are some of the problems that we see there, okay? The whole talk, all it's supposed to do, it's not supposed to tell you that psychology is bad or good. It's just supposed to make you ask questions in which you question the basic assumptions of the field. Now that's a little difficult thing to understand. So let me give you a couple of examples. What does it mean when I say psychology has these assumptions? Okay. I don't know if you guys watch English movies or TV shows, but usually there is often this trope in which there is a family and the child dies and it breaks the family apart, right? So often in psychology, the death of the child is supposed to be this massively devastating thing, the worst thing that can happen. And many people will agree with that. I, as a parent, I have a 1-year-old. Yeah, I understand that. But if you don't question this assumption, if you just assume that this is the way it is across the world, you have many problems. Let me give you 2 examples. One is the work done by Nancy Shepherd-Hughes in Brazil, okay, Rio, actually. She worked in the poorest, the shanty towns of Rio, right? The poorest of the poor regions, where infant mortality rate was so high nobody has time to spend 10 years grieving the death of a child, right? Children die every day. So if a Western psychologist comes in, or I come in with all of my knowledge, and I'm like, this is the end of your life. This is it. This is the most devastating experience. It does not translate because infant mortality rate is so high. You just have to live with kids dying. They're not even named until a certain age. And this reality, by the way, is also India's reality just a couple of generations ago. You can go and talk to your grandparents or great-grandparents if they're there. And I remember my grandfather telling me 10 years ago, he was like, I was like, what? So yeah, but 5 saal se pehle, very common normal experience because infant mortality rates were high, right? So the way grief is experienced was different. And if we don't, as psychologists, if we go in and we are like, okay, this has to be the worst thing that happened to this person, we are doing them a disservice. We are putting things in their head. I'm not going to give a second example because I'm looking at the time and I want to finish kind of on time. Okay. Okay. So if we don't question assumptions and ways of thinking, we can't question the methods and the way the research is done. I want to quickly talk about a couple of different things. When you study research, when you study the scientific method, when you consume research that might come to you in a class, or it might come to you on Instagram, I want you to ask these questions that we're going to talk about in a minute. One huge problem that we see in psychiatry, right, which is the medical form, but pretty much most of medical discipline is called corruption. There is deep, pervasive, not chota mota on the side corruption, but constant, rampant corruption in the industry. Let me give you a couple of examples. How does corruption happen? usually what happens is that research is funded by pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies, and those companies have a huge interest in getting a certain kind of result that says that this drug or this therapy works for this thing, right? And they are the ones with the money, and they are the ones doing the research. And here is a kicker. In the US, when you ask them for their data, they will not give it to you. They'll just say, no, our data is proprietary. It's under copyright. It is our private data. We are a private entity. You can't see it. So all you're supposed to be like, okay, you are telling me this drug works. I don't have any data. You are the one making the drug. I'm just supposed to take your word. That's right. That's the thing, right? So then the question is, but are they really dishonest? Maybe they're just doing good work. Let me give you the example of what is called Study 329, Paxil. Paxil was a very famous, still is a very famous antidepressant. In the UK, it's called Seroxat. Research started coming out. People started talking about how teenagers, adolescents who were taking Paxil for depression were killing themselves at a higher rate. We're like, okay, but that makes no sense. This is the thing that cures depression. So a bunch of lawyers in the US started looking at the data. They started looking at the company. The company was GlaxoSmithKline. Most of us have heard of the pharma company, and started looking at this thing called Trial 329. It was this big research that was done by a guy that wasn't even done by him. They just took an academic, a big name academic with a lot of reputation. They put his name. They were like, hey, man, we're going to do this research. You want your name on it? He was like, sure. He looked at some of the stuff. They put his name. That's called something. It's called ghostwriting. It's called ghost management. A lot of research out there in medicine is not even written by the people whose names you see. It's often written by the company, and then they go to a person with a lot of repute and they're like, would you like to put your name? And they're like, hell yeah, I would like that. It's called ghost management. Study 329 was the study that proved that Paxil was safe for adolescents. When they started looking at the real data, they found that the actual data showed the exact opposite. Compared to the group that was not given Paxil and the group that was given Paxil, amongst kids on Paxil were killing themselves at a much higher rate, right? But somehow they had been able to massage that information. We call it doing a spin. You get results, you spin it to say exactly what you wanted to spin. Say, we do it on news media every day. By the way, pretty much all news media is spin. X happened, but what you hear is a version of X happening. Us pe ek spin aata hai. And that is a very common thing that is done in research too. Another example of corruption, right? This is the work of Lisa Cosgrove. She's in University of Massachusetts in Boston. How do you know someone has a mental disorder? There is a book called the DSM, right? The book has all the mental disorders in it. US uses it extensively. A lot of other people across the world also use it. It tells you if this person has these symptoms, they are diagnosed with this. Lisa Cosgrove found out that all the people who were making DSM-4R and DSM-5, which is the giant itni moti book that has all of this information that will tell you if you have a mental disorder, a lot of the people who were writing it were getting money from pharmaceutical companies. For that matter, there are small committees, right, within this thing. One of the committees is people who write about schizophrenia, about what is the diagnosis of schizophrenia, who do we diagnose with schizophrenia, in which people hear voices and see things, hallucinations and delusions. Every member of that committee, 100% of the committee's members were getting funding from pharmaceutical companies. And that immediately puts a huge conflict of interest. Who are you serving? Are you serving the people who are paying? Honestly, if somebody was paying me, yeah, people like money. So this is kind of when we look at that you would have to be careful about, okay? When you consume research as students, it is an important important thing to look at the authors and see whether, they get funding from different medical device companies or pharmaceutical companies. For that matter, in the US, there is a database. And when I would go to a doctor in the US, I would first check the doctor. So going to a doctor in the US is very different to see if this person gets paid a lot by, some pharmaceutical company. There's a database. That too is people who are corrupt.
Lost the last 1 minute.
Okay. Am I back?
Yes.
Ooh, last 30 seconds. Should I disconnect and come back with Wi-Fi, or is it okay right now?
I think it's okay now. Yeah.
Yeah. At any point, if you think I should come back, I can do that. Okay. Yeah. If I disconnect again, let's just go for that.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, basically what I was saying is that this is corruption, and there are always some evil people and who will do evil things. Okay. But the big point here is that some of the way we just do research, some of the things that are just traditional, some of the things that are normal are also deeply, deeply messed up. So I recently interviewed this professor named Eric Turner, and he used to work with the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration. This is America's big body. Okay. Any new drug that has to come in, by drug I mean medicine, right? That's what we call drug. Any new medicine that has to come in has to go through the FDA. The FDA has to see research that shows that this medicine works, that it's safe and stuff. That doesn't usually happen, but normally it's supposed to happen like that. So this guy, Eric Turner, was working with the FDA, and he said that working with the FDA, what he found was that when he looked at, open Google and find out about, he worked on antidepressants specifically. It's like I would go open Google Scholar, find out about antidepressants and have all these amazing articles saying that they work. And I was like, hell yeah. But he said, when I was at the FDA, so all those companies and researchers were coming to me who were doing the research on antidepressants. And what he found is, if a researcher found positive results, they publish it. So it goes out into the public. But if a researcher found negative results, found that an antidepressant did not work, or that it was unsafe, or that patients did really badly on it, they just did not publish. So it never makes it out into the world. So when you go on Google Scholar and you run your little search, you get very, very biased search results. This is called publication bias, and it is common. He basically said that it was so common, it was completely normal. Of all the research he saw, 50% on antidepressant research was negative. They found it doesn't work. And 50% of the research they found was positive, finding it worked. But the only thing that got published was the 50% that showed that it got worked. And this is like, again, not a small time guy. This guy has worked with NIMH, which is National Institute of Mental Health. He's, up there with the big ones. Another thing that he told me, and this was also reiterated by Professor Diana Rose. She is at King's College London, or she was there. Both of them talked about how normal it is for researchers to get data that they don't like and then change it and crunch it and massage the numbers till the numbers say what you want them to say. So this is how Diana Rose said it. She's like, we would all be sitting with all these numbers and we would be like, okay, this is not finding anything. There is no significant result. And then everybody would keep crunching numbers differently in different ways. And one person in a corner would be like, I did it. I massaged the results in a way that I got significance, and we would go and publish it. And that's what she said. She said the 20 different times that we got nothing, nobody talks about. That never gets published. The one time that somebody's like, kuch nikla, we publish it. Eric Turner said the same thing. He said, I like how he put it. He's like, people are not bad. Always, sometimes yes. But these are researchers who have spent years doing this research. They believe, this is an important word, belief, okay? It's not evidence, it's belief. They believe that this new medication works. So they come, they're like, I'm going to help people, I'm going to get this medicine. And then they're sitting there and they're working on it for 3 years and they get their numbers. And alas, nothing. The medication is not doing better than the placebo. The therapy is not doing better than the placebo. By the way, he's also worked on therapy, psychotherapy, same thing. And what does the person do? They're disheartened. So they start crunching numbers. They change things. They bring in another, we call it secondary outcome. I'm not going to get into this. Essentially, what he said was, this is the normal thing to do. This is how our mentors taught us. This is not something we're doing in a quiet, shady, think, yeah, I will fake something. Like, this is how normal research is done. You twist the numbers until it says what you need it to say. And why that's especially devastating is that this is basic tradition in research and the way it's done, right? This is not somebody doing something bad. And the last thing, even our most coolest scienciest methods, I'm going to use that word, right? Scienciest methods like brain scans, right? We are in the age of fMRIs. Everybody loves to do fMRIs and then say, look, this is the difference in ADHD brain versus normal brains. This is the difference in autism brains versus normal brains. And repeatedly, people are coming forward and saying those studies are terrible because one, the sample size is really small, and usse bhi chota is the effect size, that the differences you're finding are meaningless. They are by chance differences, right? So, and this is fMRI, man. That's like the coolest tool we have in the box right now, right? You will see so much research out there that's like, we did research, we did fMRI scans of people with trauma. This is what we found. Again, all of that research right now is very dubious. 2 years ago, they did this international big study. This is so cool. They took a bunch of fMRI scans and they gave it to neuroscientists. 70 teams, not 70 people, 70 teams of neuroscientists were given fMRI scans and asked, "Ki isme kya ho raha hai? What do you see?" And they came up with completely different answers, right? So 70 teams could not basically agree on what the hell was happening psychologically in an fMRI scan. This is where we are. If we are not careful about questioning psychology's forms of thinking and just think like a psychologist without really considering, critique, questions, assumptions, some really shady things happen. I'm going to end with one example, and then, I think we'll have some time. So, okay, the example I will end with is the last example of what is the danger of thinking like a psychologist and not being critical of this type of thinking. In the US and like Canada and UK, there is this whole movement right now, okay, around what is called white privilege. Okay, sounds like a very good idea, that white people have a lot of privilege and that people of other races and colors don't. And there was a whole test that was developed by psychologists. It's called the implicit association test. You can right now go on Harvard website and give the test. It happens like this, and it will tell you whether you are racist or sexist or some otherist, okay? This test became super popular. It still is. हर HR company, हर कुछ ये test देती रहती है सबको. Students को सबको test देना होता है. And it basically is supposed to tell you whether you're racist or sexist or one of the other things. This focus, remember I said psychology focuses on the inside of people constantly, right? Instead of the outside. Iska danger kya hai? So what it has done is, it's told basically white people that what you need to do is you need to work on yourself. You need to become aware of your racism. You need to go and join a book club where you read book about internalized racism, and then you talk to each other about it, and then you do some self-awareness training. Okay, fine. But when you work on yourself and your inside so much, guess what happens? When the real time comes to do something, you don't want to because you've already worked on yourself. So when there are protests on the street that say that cops are killing Black and brown people, you don't have to go there. You don't have to join them. You can just sit and be like, nahi, nahi, I read a book. I went and talked to my book club. I'm working on myself about my racism. There is massive dangers there, right? And it is a very simple way of removing any kind of revolution and protest and real socioeconomic change that can happen, right? I am working on my white privilege. I'm reading this book. I'm doing meditation to understand how I have all this privilege. I don't need to go out on the street and protest. I don't have to write to my senator or my parliament member and say we need to change the law. I don't have to do any real things because I'm working on myself, right? So I'm not gonna, I wanted to end on a good note, right? But I think maybe we'll do that in the conversation we have, and I will stop talking right now, okay? Okay, all right. Questions,
Thank you,
anything?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll reserve the space. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Students.
Akanksha, why don't you like take a student's name and they can start the question and
Actually,
something?
we do have a
Yeah.
student, Khadija.
Yes, hello, Professor.
Hi.
So my question, so first of all, great talk. I really enjoyed it, and it was very insightful and really opening to what's actually happening with a lot of journals and everything. So regarding that, my question was that you yourself said it, that it takes so many years to get into a journal, and that's the reason most of us students and so many people, even professors themselves, also, you know, they just rely on any article that's been published by a very reputed journal to be able to be like a good thing to work off of or to study or to learn. But then you had mentioned that there were some, most of it is not even, most of it is garbage, like one of the people came out and said. And how that, like, so some of it is not even like done by the actual person, it's done by someone else. Some of the people aren't even actually graduated from a university that even exists. So my question is, if it takes so long to get into such journals and publish, I'm pretty sure there should be some sort of a rigorous process to check the entire background and see if it's actually a reliable study to publish. So like, is it only a fault of a couple people that are corrupt within the publishing industry of a certain journal, or is it like a problem all throughout? I just want to know your views on it.
Yeah, Khadija, that is a fantastic question. And it is a complex one. And so I'm going to answer parts of it, okay? It is not the fault of a couple of people at all. It is the way publishing is done. It is restricted to some elites. So, for example, okay, there is this person in the UK who's trying to change it, and I don't remember his name, but this is how often publishing is done, okay? I do this research, I find my results, and I send it to the journal for publication. Okay, I'm like, okay, I've done this. And the thing is, the journal often decides based on the results whether they want to publish it or not. They're not supposed to do that. You are supposed to decide based on the method, whether the method is good, whether it's been conducted properly. So, and this is especially true in psychology. In all sorts of sciences, if you do an experiment, you do it over and over and over to see if you get the same results. It's the backbone of science, replication, okay? But psychology journals, they don't like to publish studies. Ek baar ho gaya, and then they're just like, nahi, ab nahi karna. That is terrible. If you have found something, if you have a theory, if you can't replicate it, if you can't do the same experiment or study over and over in different parts and find the same result, then it is nothing, right? So if I find today that this therapy works great for these 5 people, but tomorrow a study says this did nothing to those 5 people, then the therapy might not be great. So no, it's not just a couple of people. So what this guy in the UK is trying to do is to fix this problem. He's saying that journals should publish research based on when you decide the method section, this is the method I will do, this is how I will do the research, that's when you send it. Your results should not decide. Your results matter either way. right? You found something is good, it matters. You found something doesn't work, that also matters just as much. So that's one. The way publication is done is inherently messed up. A couple of other things are there. Part of it is what I said. When pharmaceutical companies do research, they often just don't have to show the data because they can say this is private property, this is our data, and so they don't have to prove anything to anyone. Another thing is in the US, this is specific to the US. When you start a new research, you're supposed to register it. I am doing this research. You register it with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, right? And then when you are the research, you put up your results. But a lot of people who find things that they don't like, they never publish, right? Which is how this guy, Eric Turner, I was talking about, this is how he found out about antidepressants. There are all of these studies that started, but only these ones got published, right? SRQ. And then he found it was based on result. He also gave another example. He said when he started doing his own antidepressant research, he wanted to test a new antidepressant against placebo, sugar pill, like something that is inert. And he said that they did not let him do this research because they said, Nana, if you want to test it against the older antidepressant. Hame to pata hai that works, right? And he's like, but nahi, I'm a clinician. I have met patients who are saying it doesn't. And they would not even let him start. And they is the IRB. IRB is the body in the US that gives you a stamp and says you can do it. And he was like, I was just sitting there going, I can't even do this basic research to find out whether this drug works or not. So he started doing something completely different. But academic publishing at every step is a for-profit thing. So at every step, it is corrupt. And it is not, like I said, they do not check whether something was written by a person. They often don't go through the data very well. Let me give you an example. Okay, I actually had it. Okay, because we've talked about psychology, but kahan hai? Ek to wo mannitol, the brain injury drug I talked about. Another example I had is in medical science, which is anesthesiology, right? And this was this guy called John Carlise, and he started studying these articles, these research that was published in this journal called Anesthesia. Again, top-notch journal for medical professionals who are anesthesiologists. And he found that like over nearly 50%, 44% had untrustworthy data. Just some of the trials had never happened. And a lot of these studies came, guess what, from Egypt, from India, from China, Iran, Turkey, South Korea, and the US, UK, Canada, I guess. But the thing is, like, we do have this illusion that if this goes in a journal, it's perfect and it's the truth. And the truth is very, very far from it. Very, very far from it. So I hope that was a roundabout way of kind of answering your question. I see two other students, yeah.
Asta and then Samir.
Right. Hi, Professor. It was a really good talk, very well communicated. I understood everything. I just had a question revolving around the marshmallow test. So, is self-control also revolving around trust and trust issues? Because if I know that, I mean, I'm guessing that the kids trusted the teachers enough to believe that they would be awarded with a marshmallow later on, so that they would then indulge in self-control. But if they did not trust the teachers enough, I don't think they would probably grab the opportunity first and eat the marshmallow.
Right. So you're talking about a bunch of like extraneous variables, right?
Right.
And in experiments, we kind of control for them, right? And that what you're pointing to is kind of a critique of the experimental method, which is that in real world, you can't control for variables, right? That's not how life happens. So we can do some amazing, cool experiments, but we have to be very careful in what that says, right? So we can say, okay, given these kids with this socioeconomic background in this thing, if I don't think that, so in the experiment that you saw, right, that was not the original, that's just a recreation, right? Those kids probably knew the person. In the original experiment, they might not have known the experimenter or anything. But your point is really important, because what you're saying is, this is essential. Person who is in front of you when you answer a survey, the person who is in front of you when you are in a lab or you are a participant in an experiment, if that person is warm and kind and you know them, people respond differently, and all of that influences the data. Ian Parker has some really cool work around that. Like, research doesn't happen in a vacuum. These human science experiments are much more complex, right? I can talk to someone about grief in their family, and then another experimenter can come and kind of do a similar thing and find radically different results. And these things influence. And yeah, absolutely. Trust could have been such an important factor if they knew these people, if they knew the daycare workers, if they did the experiment in the daycare itself, right? Then you know the surroundings. You're not in a strange alien place. You know this place. You're comfortable here. If I put those children in a lab in another part of the city, they might be more uncomfortable. They might respond differently. They might not want to eat the marshmallow because they don't know where they are and they're kids. So yeah, those things absolutely influence every little thing.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think Samir, it was, and then Avinash.
Would you like to go to Avinash first? So I'm faculty. I'm wondering if you want to hear from the students first.
Oh, it's both are fine. That's okay.
Okay. So, I mean, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, there's so much food for thought in the talk. And I mean, a lot of questions bubbling up. So, I mean, there are 3 that I've identified, but answer however many you want to or can. But the first was, I mean, a lot of what you said is also very disconcerting, right? Especially for people who rely on, at least partially rely on psychological research to inform their ethical or political beliefs and decisions. I know I have to some extent. So, I
Me
mean,
too.
this becomes very destabilizing. So, what are some tips then on how to, be more careful while selecting what we have? Because a lot of what you're describing also seem to be insider information, right? So, this person's
Yeah.
name is on the
Yep.
study.
Yeah.
So that was one. Shall I lay out all 3 and then I mean you can
No,
pick
let's go
whichever.
one by one,
Sure.
because I will definitely forget the other 2 questions by the time.
Okay.
Samir, I wish I had an answer for that, right? It's taken years of getting into the specific field of research corruption to be able to kind of look at this. But usually in critical psychology, the question is, who does this benefit? Usually we say follow money, right? So if you are looking at a piece of research that can benefit someone, it might be a good idea to take a look at, but you are right. There is no way of finding out how many of them are ghostwritten, how many of them have, for that matter, just if this is a couple of years ago, it was a research about research that was testing when a person is a clinician, right, a therapist, or works with people, with patients, a psychologist, when they look for new techniques and when they read new research, most of them only read abstracts. And what that research found is most abstracts are spun, right? So people want to spin the abstract to make things seem, but then you go down to the data and you read that really boring results section, right? You're like, nay, this doesn't map up to what they're saying up there. But who has the time? And how are students supposed to do that? So I have no solution for you. I am just here to destabilize things. The way I do it is I just bit by bit, just, sometimes I will take a look at the piece of research in front of me. I'll try and find something about the person. Like I said, with doctors, if I was going to a doctor, I run their name through there's this database. So at least I can find out where the money come in, open doc something in the US, right? And that helps me. I know one thing. Okay, this is one resource. This Eric Turner told me. clinicaltrials.gov, I think. Okay, let me double check. Clinicaltrials.gov, I think. So yeah, okay. He told me that this is one of the places you can go to. And what this place does is it will show you every trial that was started. But if you then see that they never published, you can be like, what did they find? Another resource is Retraction Watch. I love that, right? You can go in and find the studies that were retracted. But we also know that a bunch of studies, like in anesthesia and the other one that I was talking about, when they found out that this whole thing, the person didn't exist and their institution didn't exist, the journal still did not retract the studies because it's a very embarrassing thing to do. I mean, there was nobody there, but they still won't do it. The Paxil studies, GlaxoSmithKline was fined millions of dollars, so that came out of it. But pharmaceutical companies keep a whole bunch of money aside for lawsuits. They don't get hurt by that. But yeah, I mean, even
I'm
the
thinking of,
diagnosis. Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
I'm thinking of the autism study, the vaccine that causes autism
Yeah,
kind of study.
yeah.
Even that was retracted, but it still goes around.
Yeah, exactly.
There are several examples, even in pop like literature.
Terrible studies are never even retracted. Even when they're retracted, they go around. Study 329 is still, everywhere. But so yeah, Retraction Watch, clinicaltrials.gov. That's kind of yeah. The damage is already done. That's the thing. Those kids are dead. Yeah, there is a very good episode by BBC Panorama on YouTube about Paxil. BBC used to do these panorama series. So if anybody wants to watch it, they did the first episode and they got so many people writing to them that they did a whole series. You can just type on YouTube BBC Panorama Paxil Study 329 and you can watch it. It's pretty cool. Sorry. So I have no hope. I wish I can give you a couple of resources, but
No, I mean, that's
all.
already plenty. That's stuff that is usable.
Also, we have about 5 minutes left for the talk. Maybe we can go over five more minutes, but I would like the students to have a chance on me, if that's okay.
100%.
Avinash, could you go ahead with your question, please?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
I can hear. Yeah, I can hear.
Yes. So I think this might seem like a repetitive question, but I am asking this to get some clarifications, like any particular research, like research in the scientific community, has a utilitarian like bias. Like they have a goal in the mind. Maybe the goal to find certain knowledge. Maybe that could be an outcome. Maybe it could be intervention oriented. There are certain schools who work around with improving student outcomes. So there is research involved there also. So I was wondering, like, in these two categories, can uh, the research which is oriented for knowledge can be capsulated, like not completely shared, like the way it is done, uh, so that otherwise it would lead to manipulation in terms of knowledge, and we do not know which one to trust. And the intervention could be like bordered, like these are the community of people who are doing research for an intervention, and therefore they are responsible for the knowledge they are producing and the knowledge they are using for the intervention. Is this already happening?
So, honestly, if the question is, are people being held responsible for the consequences of their research, especially when it's bad? Barely, no. Let me give you an example, okay? So this is the work of Joseph Biderman and one of his colleagues whose name I don't remember. Joseph Biderman is at Harvard Medical, right? So again, these people. He was single-handedly responsible for creating the diagnosis of bipolar disorder in children. Before that, children were not diagnosed with bipolar disorder because a child is a child, like it's a 6-year-old. She's going to be hyper sometimes, she's going to be quiet the other time, she's going to be all over the place, right? But he said that he did a bunch of research and that children can get bipolar. And as a result, there was a 40% increase in the diagnosis of kids with bipolar disorder. And with that comes the intervention strategy. So, right, you're saying like there are a group of researchers who are doing intervention, but there are a group of researchers who are doing, just finding knowledge, right? Here's a kicker. They are usually working with each other and they have consequences for each other. So this guy, Joseph Biderman, if you look at him, you're like, he's just doing knowledge production. He's just finding out that there is a thing called diagnosing bipolar disorder in children. Ye to hai. But then you find out that his money and funding came from the pharma company that made the drugs for bipolar disorder in children. Okay, that is a huge conflict of interest, huge, right? So they are the intervention people, but often they don't want to put their face where the knowledge is produced. They will have other faces of very well-reputed academics in Harvard, right? But the intervention comes from them. The money comes from them. The influence comes from them. So now to answer, are there any consequences? No. What they did when they found out that Biderman had taken money, they were like, Acha, for the next 2 years, you can't take as much money. This is what the university did to him. Harvard did, Harvard Med. For the next 2 years, you can't take this much money. And that's it. What is that? Like this guy was responsible for a 40% increase in children being diagnosed with bipolar. As a result, a 40% increase in the drugging and doping of children. And we have no idea what happened to those kids. And we did nothing. We just said, for 2 years, you can't take this much money. Not even you can't take any money, just this much money. You can't take millions, okay? Take only hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions. This was the consequence. So knowledge building and intervention might have been a cool thing if we could kind of segregate them, but they often are very mixed up, usually in not good ways.
Okay, so you are suggesting that research is both capitalistic and political.
Absolutely, 100%. It is political in that it's political, it's cultural. Research that shows that racism only exists within people, right? And not in the acts that people do makes people very complacent. They're like, mujhe to kuch karna nahi, I just need to work on myself, right? The same applies to India, and you can look at caste politics, right? You can have a bunch of upper caste people going like, I am working on my prejudice and my stuff and my discrimination. Then you don't have to do anything. You just work on yourself, right? So it's political. It's used often for political means. And it is, in its current form, thoroughly capitalistic. It is purely profit-based. All the publishing houses, I don't know if you know this, but Taylor and Francis came to Delhi High Court a few years ago saying that, Delhi University, you guys are like, you have all these Xerox copies of our books and stuff, and this is illegal, and we don't do this. And Delhi High Court was like, kuch nahi hota, education should be free, jao yahan se. But now they're revisiting the same conversation, and now that India has changed, things might be different. People are fighting the fact that SciHub.se, which is a place most lawyers and other academics in India get research. The Indian universities don't have the kind of money to pay like hundreds and thousands of dollars to publishing houses. They're going to probably shut that down too. So research is currently in its form thoroughly capitalistic and political. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Over to Tanvi.
Hi, Tanvi.
Hi. Firstly, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Tanvi, I can't hear you very clearly. Can you be a little loud or just come closer?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's a little better.
Yeah. So I think my question, it's a bit of a long-winded way to ask it, but please bear with me. So you spoke about, can you not hear me?
It's a little low, so I'm just coming close. It's okay.
No, so you spoke about how like the side disciplines have a tendency to situate the issue within the individual as opposed to the socio-political, and how we've sort of pathologized our responses to structural injustice. My question is, do you think that like an acknowledgement of the fact that social, economic, and political factors are important determinants of our mental health is at fundamental odds with the medical model? And the reason I'm asking this, I mean, I'm thinking of like Peter Sedgwick's work, for instance, who sort of argues that to like exclude madness from the realm of illness would be relying on or would constitute like a crude form of like mind body dualism. So yeah, my question is just, do you see the medical model as like fundamentally incompatible with acknowledging like the social and economic character of madness? Or do you think we can reconcile these things?
Yeah. So in its current form, that by the way, very well articulated, I must say, right? In its current form, I would say yes. And the reason usually is that we have tried it. There was something called the biopsychosocial model that we were supposed to have, right? And it never turned into biopsychosocial model. It just always remained bio model. So anytime there is like a push towards looking at sociological factors, the biological factors come and co-opt it. They absorb it. Let me give you an example, okay? Okay. What was her name? Trying to remember this feminist psychologist. I was interviewing her and she was talking about trauma. And she was one of the older feminist psychologists, one of the original ones. And she said, you know, in like the 70s and 60s, as feminist psychologists, we fought really hard to introduce trauma because we were trying to say that these ways that women are suffering is not just something inside them that's crazy. They're under so much pressure and oppression and violence and all of that. It's trauma that's doing it. And she said that when trauma was included and, you know, in the DSM and taken seriously, you know, as a sociological factor, as something that happens to a person, she said we were so happy. And then within just a few years, we saw how badly it evolved. In that trauma just became this buzzword that now is like trauma exists in the brain. You can see it happening in the brain. Here is a medicine that you can take to decrease that panic attack that you will have if you suffer from trauma. Here are the triggers. Some Xanax will help you with that. So currently, the way the biomedical model is, it has a tendency to subsume and absorb any kind of thing that is critical of it, right? And it's very good at doing it. It's the same way capitalism can do that. Anything that comes in and is critical of rabid capitalism, and by rabid, I mean capitalism that's gone out of hand, capitalism just take it. It'll be like, hey, here are t-shirts that you can buy that are anti-capitalistic, you know, and hey, here are t-shirts about feminism. Here is a mug you can buy that says, I am anti-capitalist. So these movements are powerful enough in that if we just try to make peace with them, they tend to usually absorb it. So my answer would be, yeah, currently in its form, the biomedical model is not conducive to any kind of acknowledgement that, you know, there are sociological and other factors we have to look at. It will just pick them and turn them into, it'll be like, yeah, you know, there are these social factors. That's how it affects the brain. Here are the neurotransmitters. Here is, so what happens is, going back to Avinash's question about intervention, what happens is the intervention always becomes individual. It always comes down to the individual, right? Here are all of these sociological factors. There is systemic racism. What do I do? Go to therapy. So it always comes down to individual intervention. In its current form, that is one of the things.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're running out of time, right? We have Ananya.
Yeah, maybe that will be the last question of the day. Ananya.
All right, okay. Can you hear me?
It's a little. Can you be a little louder? There's some noise in the back.
Am I audible? No? Yeah. Okay. So my question has to do with like a point you made earlier about how psychology is regional, right? It's you can't how to say impose like a perspective, a psychological perspective on another region because of socioeconomic everything factors. But I mean that is there in that uh, even like in India, like the DSM is used widely, and that is the American Medical Association's thing, right? And that, and it's also true that like psychology, because it's a study of, it's used to help the individual. Like there may be, there's this idea that there are things inherent to the human condition as a whole. Like for example, in India, in families, like hitting your child is like a method of controlling your kid, and that's like a very, you know, accepted normal thing to do. And according to maybe Indian norms, Indian social norms, that's a normal thing to do. But in America, you call it child protective services. Um, Now, like these are cultural things that maybe like one logic is that we should leave it alone. But yeah, I guess my question has to do with how do you respond to the idea that there's some things that are better overall, widely better for the human individual conditions across the world. Like how much can we apply like one set of thinking, or you know,
Yeah.
how, yeah.
Honestly, um, I would have so many examples for you that talked about how things were different because of cultural context and social context, and how, you know, about those differences. But if you were to ask me about what are called universals, um, honestly, I'm not saying they don't exist, but I haven't known one. So let's take the example of hitting your child, right? Um, One of the ways to figure out whether hitting your child is a good or a bad thing is to see what's the effect of it, right? So if I, as much as tell a student of mine in the US that this is wrong, your work is wrong, that answer is incorrect, the student can complain saying that, you know, she insulted me in front of the whole class by saying it was wrong. Why didn't she? And the student would not just be, it's easy to look at that student and be like, man, what an elite, you know, whatever. But the student would be deeply affected by being called wrong in front of their classmates, right? They would be pretty devastated by it. Now, we can compare that to, let's say, my schooling, right? जहाँ पे थप्पड़ वप्पड़ पढ़ते थे and everything, right? What was our response to that? It was to look at your friends and giggle about it, आज तेरे को पड़ गई, right? So one of the ways to figure out what is good or bad is to kind of look at how are people responding to it in local contexts, right? And if you see, if there are a bunch of, you know, if over time in India that changes, because it is changing, especially in private schools, especially amongst kids who are much more exposed to a global culture, they might find it traumatizing that their parents hit them, right? But most other kids would be like, "Pad gayi aaj," and they would laugh about it and make fun of each other and move on. We so one of the most extreme examples of this, okay, comes from the work of Christina something. I don't remember her name. It's a beautiful paper. She's an anthropologist, and the paper she's written is about a community in Indonesia that does not have the concept of rape, and what happens when something similar happens, but there is really no idea of rape. Is the person equally traumatized as Western feminists have written about, you know, sexual assault? Or are there very different genuine responses from people? So is there, if someone were to ask me what's a universal, before reading that paper, I would have said assault, sexual assault, right, of men against women would be a universal thing that is horrifying for any woman anywhere. God knows, as Indian women, we walk out and we are constantly scanning this thing. But then I read this, and she's talking about a group of women in this community that make fun of this idea that men can hurt you. And here's the paper is called "It's Only a Penis." And the idea is like, what? How can someone hurt you with a penis? It's so small. Have you seen it? What are you talking about? And they make fun of it. And so that whole trauma factor gets mitigated because of the cultural context, not created by the men, but a part of like this thing. So to answer your question, I don't have a universal. The only one I thought was sexual assault, and even that was broken down by this whole anthropological exploration. So yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's delightful again to have this stimulating conversation, to put psychology in context, its ways of thinking and doing and practicing psychology in context. So thank you so much, Ayurdhi. I think there's a lot to unpack with our students following birth, and grateful for your time and examples.
Thank you, everyone. And again, the takeaway is, if you become psychologists, just to be better ones, that's all, who don't do weird things like we are.
Yeah, like critique is not an afterthought. You have to be reflexive throughout. So I think that's the major takeaway for sure.
Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
so
Take care. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone.